I keep trying to think as a journalist, first how to capture the suffering that I see, and then how you put this back together. What is the day after? What's a future in which you're not writing every day about more dead? Tragically, a year after October 7th, that's still elusive. Nobody, I don't think, could describe what a stable Gaza is going to look like yet.
This is Impromptu from Washington Post Opinions. I'm Damir Marusic, an assignment editor here in the section. This week marks exactly 1 year since the brutal Hamas attack on Israel launched a war that has killed tens of thousands of people, displaced millions from their homes, and could spin even more violently out of control. I'm joined by two of my colleagues to talk through where the war stands today, where it's going, and how it's impacting U.S. politics.
I'm David Ignatius. I'm a columnist for the Washington Post. I write mostly about foreign policy and national security. I've been covering the Middle East off and on since 1980.
I'm Josh Rogin. I'm also a columnist of the Washington Post covering foreign policy and national security.
So, how unstable does the Middle East feel to you right now? Is this conflict worse than others you've seen?
So, through the 45 years I've reported on the Middle East, it always seems somewhat insecure. The issue is always, are we on the verge of a wider war? And now we're in the middle of a wider war. I think the question is whether that wider war could radically escalate to something even more catastrophic. My guess is that it won't. And my guess is that it's topping out in part because Israel has achieved so many of its goals. It really has reestablished deterrence in the Middle East at the cost of thousands, tens of thousands of lives. But I think Israel's nearing a point where it can say we're more secure. My own guess is that Israel will stop short of an all-out war against Iran, but I'd love to hear what Josh thinks.
Yeah, I only have about 20 years to David's 45 years of experience reporting on this region. But no, I think that I have to go ahead and disagree with David a little bit because I don't see this as wrapping up anytime soon. And I also sort of see the ongoing violence in the Middle East as part of a larger context in which we're seeing greater instability in other parts of the world, especially in Ukraine. When you sort of put it into context, I think that the difference between this Middle East conflict and the other ones that I've covered and seen in the past 20 years or so is that we live in a much more interconnected world where all of a sudden it's not really just Israel against Hamas or even Lebanon or even Iran, but Russia and China are playing heavy roles in this conflict, and Iran is playing a heavy role in the Ukraine conflict. And if you put all of this together, I think we're looking at a period of increased instability over the next years. All signs from our adversaries, Russia, China, and Iran, and North Korea, show that they're ramping up production in ways that reveal their guess that this conflict will internationally expand and get worse and require more fighting in more places. Now, of course, I hope that doesn't happen. And I think there are a lot of hardworking people in a lot of countries trying to head that off. But no, I think, on the one hand, as David pointed out very rightly and very eloquently in his column this week, the suffering is massive and is creating more instability than it's solving. And, Israel's having a series of tactical victories, in my opinion, but suffering a strategic loss and losing a lot of the support, especially inside of America, but also around the world, that it will need to depend on to be a viable and thriving country and democracy.
But it does feel like the tide is turning, right? Do you think Israel will win the war?
Well, I would just start by saying that, we saw recently in our history 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan where the United States military won every battle, every tactical engagement for 20 years and somehow managed to lose both of those wars in a strategic sense. And I think that's informative of what's happening here. It's very clear that Israel has the strongest military in the region, can exert its will in various countries, can kill a lot of people in ways that we didn't even imagine with pagers and beepers and this and that. But, without some sort of explanation at all as to how that results in an end state that brings more peace and stability in the region, I think they risk making the same mistakes that the United States made after 9/11, which is exactly what the Biden administration has been telling the Netanyahu government consistently for the last 12 months to no avail, now that they've listened. And I also think that there's no doubt that the effect that it's had on American politics and on America's ability to conduct its own leadership and diplomacy in many regions of the world has been catastrophic, and not just for one political party or the other, but for the idea that America can stand as a leader of democracies and a champion of human rights in the world. And that idea has been eroded, whether we like it or not.
So if I look at the Middle East today as opposed to a year ago, I'm struck by how in Israel it seemed weak and vulnerable to the point that its Arab adversaries began to doubt its fundamental strength, has managed to recover. And so in the kind of balance of pain and intimidation that is the Middle East, Israel's fought its way back to deterrence, back to a kind of balance. And I think the destruction of Iran's proxies, Hamas first, Hamas is basically destroyed militarily. And then Hezbollah, which through an astounding set of intelligence operations, mainly, has been decimated in Lebanon. And Iran itself, whose great asset supposedly was its ballistic missile force, has been shown to have a little bit less bite than people thought. I think those are all significant developments. The issue I've been writing about since this war began is thinking about the next day. How do you stabilize things the day after so that you begin to build stability and security for people and not just the conditions for the next war? And like Josh, I haven't seen the Israelis make any significant efforts. The United States has tried. Some of our partners, the UAE in particular, have tried to begin a conversation about that. There are all kinds of plans that are laid out in the NSC, but they've so far come to naught. And the same, I'm sorry to say, is true in Lebanon. I have a very clear vision of what a plan for a restabilized Lebanon would be. It would involve the United States helping the Lebanese army to control the territory all the way to the Israeli border. It's not a complicated plan, and it's one that's been in development for 15 years, waiting for a moment just like this, when Hezbollah was so weak it might work. But I don't yet see any effort, any serious effort on the part of anybody to make it happen. So I think to Josh's point, is this going to just continue on indefinitely? I don't think this phase will continue indefinitely. I don't think the current level of Russian and Iranian cooperation will continue indefinitely just because there's so many reasons those two countries would be suspicious of each other. I think in this war that, the people on the sidelines, most particularly the Chinese, are probably the principal beneficiaries as they watch the United States, their principal adversary, tied up in knots with a very complicated client and part of the world that's, de facto responsible for, once again, a total mess. But I don't see this escalating to a kind of prolonged proto-World War III scenario.
Yeah, I would just very quickly say that, I don't think any of us can really predict the future, but, we can just sort of look at the facts on the ground right now. And, looking at my TV screen, I don't see balance, and I don't see deterrence restored. I see, an increase of violence for sure. I see a lot of members of the Hamas and Hezbollah killed, along with a crazy amount of civilians and civilian destruction. But no, I don't see that Hezbollah as decimated. I don't think you can bomb away Hezbollah, which is a political and social organization that is rooted in Lebanese government and society in a way that is not just about, killing the actual soldiers. And Hamas is still, very present in Gaza. And again, it's sort of an idea and a movement that requires a lot more than a military solution. I'm not saying that David said anything different than that. I'm just saying that I don't see if deterrence is the goal and if balance is the goal, I don't see these tactics producing that outcome, at least yet.
Yeah. But let me then ask you both a difficult question. Not that any of these questions are particularly easy. On the one hand, Israel started, as you both said, in a bad place, but has recovered, at least, strategically. militarily. But really the person that I think sort of exemplifies this is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself, who started off besieged in office before October 7th. And October 7th was presiding over the security situation when Hamas attacked. And as you both said, he has strongly resisted negotiating a ceasefire since. And, that seemed like a huge weakness. Yet it seems like he is increasingly secure in Israeli politics. His governing coalition has expanded. His approval ratings are up internally. The opposition seems completely in disarray. And, granted, the story's not over yet, but how do you think history will treat Netanyahu? And, just to build into that is what you've both also alluded to, is the terrific human costs of all of this. It's not all on Netanyahu's fault, but there have been criticisms coming from critics of Israel that it is not being as discriminate as possible in its targeting. Israeli defenders say that this has a lot to do with the fact that both of the adversaries are dug in under population centers and they're using entire villages and cities as human shields. How does, Netanyahu and Israel come out of this war given these allegations of heinous crimes that have or have not been committed?
I'm not an expert on Israeli politics. I tend to be of the view that Netanyahu has abused the situation to protect his political interests and has become beholden to the right-wing members of his governing coalition in a way that, again, is, in my opinion, to the detriment of Israeli and U.S. interests and the regional interests. And that's my view from abroad. Internally, I can understand why Israelis broadly support an effort to restore the relative peace and security to the north, and that operation seems very popular for Netanyahu. But no, I don't think that his legacy will be a good one, either in Israel or abroad, because I think that there's just too much history there. And even before the October 7th attacks, he was doing a lot of things in Israel that made him a super polarizing and, in my opinion, destructive figure. But on the broader issue of how will Israel be remembered, I'm very saddened, both as someone who has been to Israel and as a Jewish American, to see that the legacy of this conflict will likely be the widespread perception that Israel committed widespread war crimes in Gaza. And I think there's a lot of evidence that needs to be investigated to support that. I'm not saying it happened. I'm saying that the evidence needs to be investigated by independent investigators and auditors, and there needs to be some sort of accountability. And in order for there to be peace, in order for there to be justice, in order for there to be reconciliation at some point down the line. And none of that is going on. And I don't think, as an honest journalist, I can say that the Israelis have shown any willingness to investigate themselves. And I think it's just plain for everyone to see with their eyes that you could say that their targeting is not being as discriminate as possible. I think it's obvious that when you blow up 3,000 small bombs in the middle of a crowded country, that's the opposite of discriminate. I'm talking about the beepers and the pagers and all of that.
David, we're none of us are international law experts here, but just, from a historical perspective, how do you think this will play out?
So just first about Netanyahu, on the day the war began, October 7, as that day lengthened and Israel's unpreparedness became obvious, shockingly obvious to Israelis, I think there was just a deep anger at Netanyahu for having walked the country into disaster. He'd been a poor leader. The country was divided in a way it never has been before. I think he was close to being reviled by many Israelis. He's clawed his way back. I likened him to a man who's been dangling on the side of a skyscraper, holding on with his bare hands. And he managed to do it. And then Israeli force of arms, Israeli skill in intelligence operations got them back to this position of relative strength. I think Netanyahu will still go down in history as a terrible Israeli leader. The shattering effect of October 7 will be his legacy. The recovery from October 7 will be a part of his legacy too. Have to see how that in the end works out. I think on this question of the war crimes, alleged, extreme use of violence against Palestinian and Lebanese civilians, I've done a good deal of reporting on that, and the simplest thing I can say is that when I have quizzed the people who were responsible for Israeli targeting and asked them, what are your rules of engagement? How do you minimize civilian casualties? they go through a kind of yada, yada, yada. It's a series of rules about the circumstances surrounding the place of engagement, et cetera. And then they get to a point where they say, but of course, these rules can be suspended if Israeli troops are under threat. And that was the case through all the first months of Gaza in Israel's mind. And I think that just the restraints were off. Israel was in a state of national rage and trauma, to people just who were in a free fall. And they fought like people in a free fall with a kind of desperate energy and intensity. And I think as people look back on what was done, they'll feel a sense of remorse. Was it necessary that so many civilians died in this war?
Let's take a quick break. When we come back, more on the United States' role in all of this.
Hi, this is Megan McArdle. I'm a journalist and opinion columnist here at The Post. And today I want to recommend the podcast called Reflector. Reflector's team and I recently did 3 episodes where we dove deep into America's political history of making claims that a U.S. election was stolen.
A lot of Republicans believe that the election was stolen, and they want Nixon to fight. And Nixon doesn't. He concedes.
Once the decision is made, we unite behind the man who is elected.
I know that many listeners are always on the hunt for a new podcast, and Reflector's not only a place to find great stories. They're also committed to fairness, independence, and nonpartisanship in their coverage of even some of the thorniest issues facing our society. To listen, just search Reflector in whatever app you're using to listen to this podcast right now. And thanks.
Welcome back. I'm Damir Marusic, and this is Impromptu. So, Ukraine recently launched an expedition into Russia's Kursk region without alerting the White House, and Israel similarly launched its assault on Hezbollah with what seems like zero notice to Washington. And throughout the Gaza operation, Biden himself has voiced frustrations at Netanyahu's refusal to temper Israel's response. Why has our president's word been so easy to ignore, do you think? Is this a question that, a broader question of policy, or is it something else that's going on in the world that the United States is unable to control these kinds of conflicts?
So I do think that the United States has had more trouble than usual dealing with small, headstrong allies. Ukraine and Israel are the instant cases. But this is a recurring problem in American foreign policy going back to South Vietnam. I mean, South Vietnam drove the United States crazy by playing American politics, by resisting our proposals for ceasefires, alternative strategies. I think that the power of the weak is to start conflicts they can't finish, to write checks they can't cash in the expectation the United States will bail them out. And we can't or won't. We don't have the political wherewithal in terms of forcing Israel to do things, and Ukraine is infinitely complex. Keep saying we don't want to make them do a deal if they're not ready to do. But I think this is a problem that's especially visible with Biden, but it's something that I've seen, look at the Balkans with Clinton, look at Vietnam with several presidents. It happens over and over again. And I don't think our superpower has ever figured out a way to flex its muscles adequately. But the problem is so severe now. I'd be very curious what Josh thinks is the cure, but it is a real problem.
Sure. Well, I think you raise a great point, Damir, but we need to draw a clear distinction between Ukraine and Israel in the sense that Ukraine, although has done some things without informing us, has not openly and directly defied the U.S. administration that is providing it with its vital lifelines. And the example is that they haven't used U.S. weapons to strike deep into Russia, despite publicly stating that they need to do so in order to win their war, whereas the Israelis are openly, telling Biden that his publicly stated desire to stop in Lebanon, that they have no intention of following that, and they're going to use American weapons to defy the U.S. government, and they know that there will be no consequences. And that gets at the core of your question. What makes these things different is that everybody knows that President Biden has been a lifelong Zionist and a firm supporter of Israel, and everybody knows that Israel enjoys bipartisan congressional support that Ukraine can only dream of having. And because of the politics involved in the 2024 election, there is no impetus in the Biden-Harris administration to have any sort of get tough approach with Netanyahu, because they fear it would harm them in the upcoming election with Trump, who is willing to give Netanyahu carte blanche if elected, which he stated on multiple occasions. So the first answer to your question is that the Biden administration is impotent because President Biden is a lame duck. And that feeds the second part of your question, which is the only solution is a new administration, and if that new administration decides to pursue a new policy. And the problem with that, of course, is that Vice President Harris has not stated in any way that she intends to pursue a new policy. Quite the contrary, even as she seeks the support of Muslim Americans and Arab Americans in places like Dearborn, Michigan, and she's not getting it, by the way, and it could cost her the election, by the way. And so that's the answer to your question, is that, America is a great superpower that has a ton of leverage, but only if it has the political will to use it. And in many ways, our foreign policy is constrained by our domestic politics, especially right now, and those heavily favor Israel, and they very heavily influenced the Netanyahu government's calculation in perpetrating the war in whatever way they see fit.
I think the most interesting question that's ahead is the United States and Iran. Israel and Iran too, but in the end, it's the United States that is going to have to finish whatever Israel starts. We should not forget that Donald Trump is under a very specific threat of assassination by Iran. The FBI evidence of this plotting is very real. They call it an active threat. They arrested somebody in August who was part of a plot to kill Trump and other officials. Trump has been warned about it, briefed about it. So if he comes into office, I think that's going to animate two things. One, there's a very real possibility that he will try to attack to seek revenge for this plot to kill him. Second, I think Trump, the deal maker, the biggest deal he could do would be a deal with Iran. And crazy though it sounds, this moment before he would take office, in which his very life is threatened, makes the life drama for Donald Trump of then going trying to make a deal all the more tantalizing. So I think with Trump that he is the disruptor. He is the person who will do the things you never could imagine. And, either war or peace, something big is going to happen in the U.S. Iranian relationship.
Okay, I think we're out of time. David, Josh, thank you for joining me on this episode of Impromptu.
Thank you.
Thank you, Damir.
Thanks for listening to Impromptu. This episode was produced by Hadley Robinson and edited by Chris Sulentrop and Allison Michaels. It was mixed by Emma Munger. Special thanks to Millie Mitra and Deirdre Byrne. Send us your thoughts on the show. We've been loving the messages we've been getting, and we read every one. Email us at impromptu@washpost.com.